Okay, hello there everybody. This is Provo Pre-Med. This is just my YouTube channel to try to help BYU pre-meds navigate that very precarious and scary time while at BYU. I think this can apply to any pre-med student, but specifically I'm tailoring most of my presentations here to BYU Provo students in particular. Though, as I said, if you're going to any BYU affiliated school, any other campus, I think the same principles will apply, but the specifics that I will get into sometimes really have more to do with the campus in Provo, Utah. So we're going to get right into it because I know that you are very busy. Overview. So this is just an overview slide explaining what we're going to get into today. We're going to talk about why am I doing this. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of being a pre-med at BYU because that's very important to keep in mind. We're going to talk about the helpful hints that you should have at the beginning, I believe, and then a broad overview of each year, and then just some final thoughts. And don't worry, there will be other videos beyond this that you should check out and watch where I explain more stages and more things that should happen, and I go into more depth and detail into each phase of being a pre-med at BYU and everything like that. So I have a slight disclaimer that I need to put out here because I just want to be honest with you. So I'm a third-year DO student on the East Coast, osteopathic medical student. If you, like me, went to BYU, many people get turned off at the idea of being a DO, and I understand that perfectly well, and I'll probably make a video about that later. I understand that because the DO is, generally speaking, easier to get, it's easier to get into those schools. Many BYU students who are very bright and remarkable and shoot for the stars get turned off to it, and they sort of look down on it and will turn up their nose at even the idea of applying to DO school. And I did go to BYU and I graduated from there in 2023. So I know I'm not just making this up. I remember what that was like to have the really smart BYU students feel like they were failures if they had to apply to DO school or even go to DO school. But that's a different topic for a different video. But I want to be honest with you because some of you will watch this video and you will say, well, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about because he's a DO, and DOs by definition, they suck. So I don't want to listen to what he's going to say. And I understand that, but I also want to be honest that the advice that I have here isn't just what I did, it's also the things that I wish I would have done, and it's also the collective experience of my other friends who attended BYU with me, who went to extremely prestigious medical schools in the United States, and who also went to DO school. So I cover their thoughts and everything that they went through also, just like my own thoughts and my experiences. So the advice I'm giving you is not just from a DO student who wasn't smart enough or wasn't good enough to get into an MD school. My advice is also from BYU students who got into MD school as well. So keep that in mind if you want to. I understand if you don't want to listen to me anymore. So we're going to talk about the pros and cons of being a pre-med at BYU. This is really important. BYU is an amazing school, but it has some cons if you're going to be a pre-med student, and we need to talk about those just so you're aware, because down the road, if you start to get frustrated, it's going to create unproductive anger instead of helping you along. So we're just going to go over that really quick. So the pros at BYU. BYU is a prestigious campus. Regardless of what some media sources will say, BYU is an amazing university, and the faculty there are, generally speaking, really prestigious. Some media sources in the U.S. will criticize BYU for being a private religious university and say because of that they exclude certain candidates who are not religious or LDS. And regardless of whether or not that's true, that doesn't mean the faculty at BYU are not renowned or very knowledgeable or prestigious. because you can be those things and still be LDS. BYU has that, so keep that in mind. The faculty at BYU are amazing and great to learn from. BYU also has amazing infrastructure, and by this I'm talking about the campus is organized very well. It makes it easy for you to sometimes be a pre-med. It has the YServe department, which is incredible, the Life Sciences building, the Simmons Cancer Research Center, right? These beautiful buildings that have lots of programs in them. It's great. And lots of universities actually just do not have a YServe, something that allows you to get, non-paid clinical and non-clinical experience to put on your medical school application. Most undergrad universities don't have this. They don't all have it, and BYU does, so that's great. Lots of great resources. The tuition at BYU is really cheap, obviously, and in my personal experience, I think the curriculum at BYU will prepare you very well for medical school. Now, I can only speak to this as a DO. As a DO, I think this was 100% the case. I will not pretend to be very smart at all, but I got into several DO schools, and I basically did not study at all the first 2 years of my didactic education in DO school. And like I said, I do not pretend to be a really intelligent, bright, remarkable student. So if I was able to do that, then that means if you're out there and you're most likely much smarter than me, you're going to do great wherever you go to school at. And that's because BYU is it's a tough school. The research at BYU is amazing. And what I mean by this is that's not just the research infrastructure that's there, but you have lots of opportunities to take part in benchtop research and clinical research, and you can do social sciences research and all that sort of research that you want to do. It's kind of amazing that you have access to that, because there are many schools in the United States, medical schools, that don't have it. And that's a topic for another video as well, but BYU is well connected and has all those things. And then finally, the acceptance rates to MD schools out of BYU they're not amazing, unfortunately, but they're not terrible. They're just not what they could be. The cons, the BYU pre-med advisors are really bad, and they've been bad for a really long time. And I say that because even the docs I shadowed, who graduated from BYU back in the 90s or earlier, said the same thing, that even their advisors at BYU were really bad and they didn't seem to know what they were doing. And my experience there was much of the same. I think they've gotten slightly better. Their website has been tricked out, and they've gotten a lot better at trying to keep students accountable and try to help them a little bit more, but they're just really not that great. And the acceptance rates, which we will look at, bear this out. And then finally, the cons that you're probably aware of is BYU is a very difficult school. So just remember that, because it's hard to keep a 4.0 GPA there, and it's okay to be frustrated at that, because you will have friends who go to community colleges or other universities, and they went to classes that didn't have tests. They went to classes where they could cheat easily. They went to universities with classes where it was not very rigorous, and maybe they'll be walking into med school with a 4.0 GPA where you worked like a mad person just to try to get that GPA. So it's true. That is a thing. And then the worst part, I think, at BYU is nobody is really going to help guide you, and I think that's a big problem. But some would criticize what I'm saying and say that, oh, well, if you're a really great MD candidate or something like that, you don't need anybody's help, and nobody should guide you because the real world isn't like that or something. And I don't believe that. I think it's okay to help each other, and I think it's okay to have advisors who really try to take your hand and guide you, because this is a complicated process. Here are some of the MD applicant facts and some of the matriculation acceptance rates. As you can see here, this was 2021-22, the students accepted, right, we had a 41% acceptance rate out of BYU that year, and the national average was 43. So we were actually doing badly that year for whatever reason. And in recent years, they have really jumped it back up. And I think BYU has gotten better than it has. So I think in the past, it was just sort of middle of the road. Lots of people were applying to MD school, but that doesn't necessarily mean lots of people were getting accepted who should have been accepted. And it's gotten slightly better. So now BYU is maintaining basically about 10% above the national average getting into MD school. But there's a couple things here that are still kind of bothersome for me. And one of those things is that, the national average accepted MCAT is a 512. But for some reason, MD candidates, BYU students who are applying, need to get a higher MCAT. And that should make you ask a couple of questions. Why do all other students across the U.S. really need to get only a 512, regardless of race or ethnicity? But for some reason, BYU students have to get a 515 in order to get into MD school. That is kind of strange. It shouldn't be that way, right? You would expect, if BYU has such bright students and great faculty and great infrastructure, that we would have a really high acceptance rate, and the averages would be much higher. BYU would have 515 averages, but then we'd have like a 70 or 80% acceptance rate or something like that. Or maybe we'd have an 80% acceptance rate, but everybody would have an average 512 MCAT or something like that, and that's not the case. Again, 24-25, same sort of thing. BYU is about 10% above the national average. The good news about this is the acceptance rates into DO school out of BYU are extremely strong, just very, very, very strong. And so for those of you out there who are considering going DO or MD or trying to figure out what's going on, it's going to be okay. If you really want to be a doctor, you're definitely going to be able to do it, because the acceptance rate out of BYU to DO school is so high that if you put together a decent application, you're going to be a doctor one day, and that should make you feel good to know that. Okay, so helpful hints. Just take a breath when you start this journey. The pre-med journey really is a marathon. It's not a sprint. You kind of have to take a burn the ships approach, and you have to really commit yourself, and you're going to be probably scared at times and worried and stressed, and that's okay. Just breathe through it. Realize that, Rome wasn't made in a day, and the same thing applies to your application. So just keep going. It's okay. The other thing I want to remind you is modern physicians, and this is another video I'll probably have to make, modern physicians have no idea what you're going through, not just at BYU, but the modern medical education landscape. And again, I don't want to belabor this. I'll talk about this later. But most physicians have no idea what you're going through. When you shadow physicians who graduated med school back in the early 2000s or the 1990s, it was not the landscape it is today. It was not nearly as competitive. There were a lot of things that were different. The MCAT was not 7 hours long. Acceptance rates were not this low. They did not have to have 15 things to put on their med school applications and maintain a 4.0 GPA and all this sort of stuff. They did not have to do that. And I'll talk more about that later, but if you actually talk to your parents who are physicians or family who are physicians or the people you shadow and ask them about the things they did, it's going to pale in comparison to what you had to do. It'll be really funny if you ask them the things that they have to do, and they'll say, well, I think I shadowed one doctor, I can't remember his name, and then I think I sort of got good grades. I don't know, and then I went and took the MCAT, I studied for it for maybe a month, and I did okay, and then, I got accepted. That will be very common. You will find there are a lot of people who say that. So you got to be careful if you're going to take advice from modern physicians, because they may have your best interest in heart, but their advice may be so antiquated because they have no clue what it's like. And I've seen it so many times where people will say, well, my dad said, because he's a physician, I'll do fine on the MCAT as long as I just take my prerequisites. And they're totally wrong, because when their dad or mom took the MCAT, it was 4 hours long. Not everything was passage based, yada, yada, yada. So keep that in mind. And the last thing, do not take advice from the BYU pre-med advisement people at all if they are discouraging you in any way. That is very important. I can make a video about this later, but an advisor is not supposed to discourage you. That's not his or her job. They're doing a bad job if they're discouraging you. An advisor is supposed to help inspire you and help you put together the best application possible. So if you go in and you say, I want to be a doctor and my GPA is low, and they say, well, I don't know, you're probably not going to get in, then you need to drop them like fourth period French, because that is not what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to look at you and look at your application and say, okay, well, let's see. This is how we could probably bring up your GPA. These are the schools you could probably apply to. Let's see, these are the ways we could boost your application, blah, 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 blah. So if they're not doing that, do not listen to them. Quick overview of each year. You can find these overviews online, so don't think this is the end-all be-all for an overview. But this is just something to think about, okay? Year one is for you to take it slow. It's for you to learn how to study and get used to your classes. That's it. And you can explore extracurricular activities, explore YServe, things like that. But don't feel like you have to commit, because you don't. Make sure, just get an idea of what you want to study. What's your major? Are you going to get a minor? Which you probably should. Am I going to be successful? What classes am I going to take? How am I going to study? How much time am I going to have to spend each week to get like a B or an A or whatever it is that you want? That's what year one is for. Once you get to year two, then really map out what you're going to do for the next few years, and try to do this sort of at the end of year one going into year two. And then try to plan out your classes. Try to plan out leadership, service, things like that, because you need a burn the ships approach if you're going to do this, and not be stressed when you're applying. And in year three, think about your personal statement, write a draft or two. Do not wait until last minute to write a draft. Decide then and there how you will study for the MCAT. Do you have money? Do you come from money? Are you going to be able to spend money on a prep course? Or are you going to have to just find free resources and maybe take a cheaper prep course or whatever it is in order for you to take it? And then you're going to apply to med school, ideally year three. But not everybody does, so that's something else to keep in mind. And then year four, you finish up your classes, finish fairly strong, determine what's going to happen next. Are you going to do a Master of Science program, which we'll talk more about those later? Are you going to take a gap year? Are you going to take the MCAT again? Those are things you need to think about. Okay, there will be more videos to follow. Do not get discouraged. This path, especially at BYU, but in our medical system in general, it's designed to weed out lots of people, and it really breaks you down. BYU doesn't necessarily always help with that. It sometimes makes it worse. So it's okay if you just take a breath. If you go in to Chem 105 and you get a C or you fail it, do not panic. You can still go to med school. You can still be a doctor. If you get multiple C's in your grades, you can still go to med school. People will tell you you can't, but that's not true. Take a breath. Relax. It's going to be hard, but if you plan things out, if you try to educate yourself on the path and what needs to happen next, and I'm here for that. I'm trying to make videos to sort of help you navigate that, then it'll all be okay. Last thing, think hard if you want to go into this career, and I'll make more videos on it, but it's really hard. It doesn't matter if you're going to MD school or DO school. There's a lot of things that are going to make you start taking SSRIs. So you got to be sure that you want to do this, because there are lots of medical students right now and lots of doctors who are looking at their lives because of burnout and thinking, you know what? Yeah, the debt is high, but honestly, dentists don't do anything, right? They sit in a chair and they look at patients' teeth and they do procedures with their hands, but most people are not dying if you're a dentist. And the same thing if you're an optometrist or a nurse anesthetist or a podiatrist, right? Those people are making decent money and they're not as stressed as doctors are. Even if you read some sort of study that says that dentists have a high suicide rate, it's not the same thing as it is for physicians who have to see people dying every day, okay? So just think about it hard and it'll be okay. All right. I'll see you at the next video.